Hey, everybody. Welcome out to the LDRship Podcast. I'm your host for today, Brett Miller, but this is the LDRship. This is our podcast where we get to bring together the voices from all the sides of our political spectrum so we can actually have a thoughtful, civil discussion where we can actually talk about things and get along with each other and not have to yell and scream at the other side and actually have, again, civil discourse through this. But we're going to engage in some real conversations today. We got our folks, Dion from the Libertarian side of things, and then we have Will and Thea who are representing the Democratic side. I represent the Republican background. But we're going to go over and talk about some issues that are near and dear to the hearts of the people. Today's going to be a little bit interesting. We're going to be talking about if we were king or queen for a day, what policy would we essentially adopt from either a different government or different policy to integrate into it? So our goal with this, as with every one of our podcast guys, is that we want to bridge divides, right? We want to foster understanding around these ideas. And we just want to have this respectful space where we can talk about some serious topics, right? So whether you're passionate about policy or just looking for that fresh perspective, we're here to lead the way where our disagreements can inform your decisions. So with that, guys, let's go ahead and jump into our topic for today. Dion, how about you lead us off with the libertarian perspective on what you would do if you were king or queen of the day?
You want to start with that bombshell, huh?
Let's do it. I think it's fun.
All right. So, well, first of all, I think I might have to apologize to our listeners and viewers. I was having some severe technical difficulties today, so I had to switch cameras and everything. I'm using my mobile phone instead of my normal setup with my high quality microphone and everything. So if I sound weird or whatever, I apologize. I had to duct tape and Band-Aid and bubblegum this thing together for tonight. All right. So if I were king for a day, that actually puts me into a really weird spot as a libertarian, right? Because that's absolutely not the position that a libertarian wants to be in, right? I don't want to have that much control over anybody except for myself. But if I were king for a day, I would go all Javier Milei on everything here in the country. And for those of you listening or watching, if you don't know who Javier Milei is, he is the recently elected president of Argentina. He's been in office for close to a year now. I think they had their elections around this time last year. And basically, he is sort of the first professed libertarian to ever find himself in the position where he's running an entire country. And by God, is he doing some libertarian stuff. So just a little bit of background here. Argentina has been experiencing just absolutely god-awful inflation. So when he came in, the inflation was at a peak of about 300%. So if for those of us here in America who have been feeling the crunch on our gas, on our groceries and everything, that was at about overall about a 20% inflation from about 4 years ago. We're talking 300%. So they were very much hurting from all of this. Also, it's estimated that about 60% of Argentina's populace was receiving some sort of government subsidy prior to Javier Milei taking office. So if you know anything about economics, you would probably know that that is unsustainable, right? The only money that the government has is money that it taxes other people to get, all right? The government doesn't make money on its own. And so when 60% of your populace is receiving money from the government in some way, shape, or form, that means that the 40% have to bear the entire burden of not only running the government itself, but also paying for those other 60% of the populace. This is not a very sustainable way to run an economy. So Javier Milei came in and he cut their federal budget by 30% right off the bat. And then recently, this was in the news, and hopefully you guys saw it because I thought it was cool. He shut down Argentina's version of the IRS, just completely shuttered the doors and said, oh, and they were the equivalent of like a department here. They were a ministry. So that'd be like the equivalent size of like the Department of the Treasury. And what he did was he shut that down and then he recreated a new office that was much smaller. And that one is an an agency or something. So it's a smaller organization. So it's more like the size of what our IRS is compared to the Department of the Treasury, although it is far, far smaller than what our IRS is. Argentina is a smaller country as well. So has he been successful? Well, a lot of people will say that he's definitely caused some short-term pains. People are still feeling it. The people who were laid off from the federal government, they're still feeling the pains of not having a job. So he's having to work that with the private sector and try to come up with ways to generate jobs and revenue in the private sector so that those people are not then just becoming part of the problem of having to require government subsidies to live. But he has driven inflation down from the 300% that they were seeing down to about 123%, which is still god-awful painful, but a lot better than 300%. And he's done that within a year. So props to him. Now, it remains to be seen if all of these drastic measures are going to have long-lasting effects, right? It remains to be seen if this is a feasible long-term solution to government. A lot of people from the Libertarian Party think so. A lot of people think, if we just let the free markets kind of do their thing, then society overall will be better. Clearly, you don't go from having a lot of government to having no government overnight. But we don't know how far he's going to take it. Like, is he done chopping, or does he have more chopping to do?
Dion, can you then translate that to how you would apply it to America? Because some of the stuff that you prefaced it with, we're not in the same position that Argentina was in. So what's your vision for how that would look here in the United States?
So I think here in the United States, one of the biggest things that is going to crush us, maybe not our generation, but definitely our children's generation, is the national debt. Right now, we're okay because our debt is approximately equal to our GDP. And right now, population-wise, we seem to be at least moderately stable, so that our future working force is going to be just about big enough to continue to produce in the GDP to hopefully match long-term debt at the rate that we're spending. However, as we've seen, we're at $36 trillion national debt right now. We're not cutting back on spending, right? We keep spending more and more. We have entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare that take up almost 2/3 of our overall budget. And so what I think that translates to is probably short-term pain, where unfortunately people like myself should be out of a job, right? In episode 1, when we introduced ourselves, I said that I work for a defense contractor. I actually would like to see most of those jobs go away. I think the military-industrial complex has gotten too big. I think that the bureaucracy has gotten too big. And so, yeah, I think when I say I would go Javier Milei on everything, I think I probably would impose something kind of like Obama tried to do with the, what was that called? Back in 2013? Not austerity. Come on, help me out. We were all like DOD back then.
I mean, I remember sequestration, but I'm not sure what you're referring to.
That's
okay. Yeah.
Sequestration, right? Something like that. I got to give Obama and the Congress at the time props, where we cut back spending. It wasn't enough, and we didn't do it long enough, but it was something that we needed to do. And ultimately, everything did survive. And I think that we could do it again. So that's kind of where I am. We have a lot of fat that we could cut.
Okay. Well, I think that was a pretty good perspective. Let's have your take.
Okay, I was like, are we rebutting each other's ideas, or are we just saying this is my idea?
or by all means, we should rebut. Like, if you think that's a crazy idea, like let's hear why it's a crazy idea.
No, I mean, I just, it's like, I guess I have to wrap my head around it. I guess my only my only pushback would be, you said that 2/3 of the budget are tied, or two-thirds of our spending are tied up in like Medicare and Social Security. But then when you talked about cutting, you talked about like the military industrial complex. So I guess the question, and I know this has come up in a previous podcast, are you basically saying that you would want to cut Medicare and Social Security? Because in order for the math to math, those programs would have to take a cut.
Yeah, so I definitely would want to cut Social Security. Now, what I would like to do is Bush actually, I think, had a really good plan for Social Security, and I wish we had done it back in 2005, because I think every American would be richer now. He wanted to privatize Social Security, which didn't mean taking it completely out of the government hands and just throwing it out to private industry. But what it meant that when they took Social Security out of your paycheck, instead of just putting it into treasury bonds like they do now, which earns an abysmally low amount of interest and is unsustainable, they actually would have invested it into the market. And if you remember what the market was doing, aside from the 2008 crash, which was a blip, but if you look at the long term, where most of us would be now, you would see that like most of us would have about 3 to 4 times the amount of money in our Social Security accounts now as we do today, based on the current process.
Would flooding the markets with that amount of cash dilute everything to the point where we wouldn't actually have gained the way that you think? I don't know enough about it to know, but I mean, the amount of money that you're talking about putting into the market is, we would be the largest hedge fund. Social Security.
So I imagine that there may be like a short-term sort of bear reaction in the market. But I mean, if you think about the purpose of the stock market, right? And the main purpose of the stock market, the reason why people buy stocks in companies is because they are basically saying, here, company X, I believe that you guys are going places. So I'm going to give you initial capital, right? I'm going to give you cash today that you can use to go buy infrastructure, do R&D, whatever it is you're doing, right? In the hopes that you will become successful in the marketplace and the value of my stock will rise. And so if you think about like, if that money is flooding into the market, it's hard to imagine that companies would not then flush with cash, go do something with it, right? You would hope.
Like give dividends to their shareholders.
Well, yeah, but now you're a shareholder, right? I mean, that's the beauty of the market, is that when these companies are now working for the shareholders, they're working for you.
Yeah, but I'm not getting that money out for a generation. And so then how are we? I don't know. I think, I just think that it seems like a different version of a stimulus. The same, like you're still artificially pumping in a huge, tremendous amount of money into the market. And then it sounds like you're basically making some, like the assumption that it's going to equally come back out. And I don't know if that economically makes sense the way you're describing it. I don't know. I think sometimes what I'm starting to get a gauge of our podcast is that I think that you have a distrust in government and I have the same distrust in private industry. So like, that's where I'm always like, anytime the answer is we're going to rely on private industry, I'm like, but I feel like you have the same feeling when it's like, well, there's a government program for that. So yeah.
Yeah. So
that's the point of this podcast.
Yeah. I also distrust private industry, but I think that what exists in private industry and what our founding fathers tried to create in our government with the checks and balances seems to work better in private industry than it does in the government. So we seem to find like loopholes and stuff in the government in these checks and balances and stuff where if you let the market go, usually problems take care of themselves, right? So there are exceptions. I will admit, we had our robber barons and everything, but we also can't ignore the part that was played by government regulations with things like the railroads and with the telegraphs and things like in newspapers and things like that actually helped these guys initially create a monopoly before they took down their monopolies.
Okay. Well, I think we should. I guess who we can go on to the next idea, because I think there's a lot of food for thought there, Dion.
Oh, and I guess I should also offer one more clarification, lest Will come back and say, I can't believe the Libertarian said he still wants to keep Social Security. I do not want to keep Social Security. What I offered was a short-term plan there so that the people who have paid in all their lives and are expecting that check when they turn 65 aren't all of a sudden told, too bad, the government stole all your money and you get nothing. What we need to have is a way to wean everybody off of the government doing it for them and providing everybody a method of choice whereby they get to choose their destiny and say, I mean, so most people, their employers offer like a 401k, or, there are Roth IRAs out there. And a lot of times those 401ks or even like the TSP is broken down by sort of like risk sectors. And so there are like index funds and commodities and things like that are very low risk. And they don't earn as much of a return over their lifetime, but you're pretty much guaranteed to get 3 to 5% off of your investment by the time you retire, which is not bad. And then,
the one thing I'm going to push back on you, because you said something that I don't think you meant, like you realize that the emphasis when you said most people, their employers offer, and I'm going to push back. That's not true. I think most people who are employed in the U.S. don't have access to those types of plans. In our professions, we have access to it, but I don't think that's the truth for most Americans that are working.
Yeah, so you're right. So wage earners and tip earners, they're not going to have access to 401k plans, are they? So, but that's also something that probably should be remedied.
Yeah, I agree with you.
All right. So it's 2 days before the election when we are recording this. And much like Dion, while I don't think being a king for a day is quite what I would want electorally in the United States, I'm going to offer up a couple of alternatives or tweaks to our electoral system, because that is front and center on my mind. I'm working on the presidential on a presidential campaign right now, and I'm going to throw a couple of things out there and then let you all go to town on it. In the spirit of this podcast, I would like to see some version of proportional representation, so that poor Dion, when 2% of America votes for the Libertarian should get 2% of the seats in Congress. Some version of that, so that we can have a little bit more diversity of viewpoints, a little bit more, giving everybody the option to vote for who they actually want, rather than all of the libertarians at heart having to choose what could be the lesser of two evils between the Democrats and the Republicans, if they really want their votes to count. I would like to see, perhaps less controversially, a national holiday for Election Day, and which could be paired with mandatory voting. But the only way you can have mandatory voting is if you made it a national holiday, so that everybody has the opportunity to vote. But it can't be like current federal holidays where 50% of the businesses are still open. It's just the federal government that's closed. Everything would need to shut down so that people could actually go vote. And just to play the contrarian a little bit, I would not want to abolish the Electoral College, which I know Thea and I would disagree on. So of those three, electoral tweaks. What do you guys think?
Well, when you talk about some type of the representation, are you talking specifically for just the House of Representatives or the Senate? Are you saying you're taking it away from the geographical, allotments we have for seats and now making it just like, I'm trying to figure out how it works. Is it just like everybody vote?
Essentially, the way that it is in the UK is it's still geographic, but larger. And then it's not a single member district. It would be something like Florida has 27 Congress people. So when you go to vote in Florida, if the Libertarians happen to capture 5% of the vote, then 5% of those seats would go to the Libertarian. It would be something akin to that. But what that, maybe the downside of that is because it's geographically by, like, say, Florida, all of the representatives could live in Miami. Where they live is not, because the districts are not spread throughout Florida, and it's not quite as the geography is not quite as limited or strict. You could end up with everyone lives in Miami, and then really that's where all the representation comes from for the state of Florida. That would be a downside to it.
But it's still, I guess what I'm still saying, but it would still be like, let's say you still have like Republicans, Democrats. If that were the case, it would just be because that's what that party, they just selected folks from that particular area. But the votes would have come in from around throughout the whole state.
Yeah, but the upside is that when Libertarians can only get, and Dion, I'm making these numbers up, I don't know, if Libertarians can only get 5% of the vote, they will never win a winner-take-all single member district race. But if they can win 5% of the vote in Florida, now they get at least one seat.
Yeah. And I actually think you're also proposing a solution for a lot of the gerrymandering that we see that dilutes a lot of people's votes, especially certain types of minority groups. So, yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a viable solution. Obviously every issue or every solution that we even propose or that anybody proposes, nothing's perfect, right? There's always going to be some issues somewhere. It's never going to be a perfect system. And that inherently comes from there's never going to be perfect people, right? There's always going to be some issue. Somebody's going to try to skirt something around it. But I think something like that could actually work. You'd start getting more representation. And I think you'd have parties playing more towards the midline, more of the general populace than you'd have with these extremes that you'd see, again, where we see the extreme left and the extreme right, to where we just have this jump from one ditch to the other rather than trying to stay in the middle of the road. But if you had to include the Libertarians and the Green Party, and I mean, those are the two that come to my head, but there's a lot of others. If they started getting more representation, I think it would cause people to have to work together more. And I think we'd actually get a lot more done.
I'm intrigued by that idea, and there's parts of it that sort of don't sit well with me, and I'm trying to put my finger on why. One of the things, though, is like,
how could it not sit well with you? It's the only plan that gives you a seat in Congress.
So one of the things is I lived in England for 3 years, and so one of the things that a lot of people here in America, I think, forget is that you could fit 2 United Kingdoms into Texas with room to spare, right? So not only is it a geographically small country and pretty well packed in, but it is very homogenous compared to the United States. Like, you see more difference between, say, a Bostonian and somebody from Richmond, which is about the distance between, say, like Scotland and the south of England, than you see between Scots and Welsh and English. So that's kind of where my brain is sort of getting a little bit. I can't get over the hurdle of the geographic aspect that we lose, especially in the very large states.
Real quick though, Dion, you used a small parliamentary government as an example, but India is the largest democracy in the world, and they have a parliamentary system. So that's where I'm I'm having a hard time. Yes, I understand England. We don't look like England, but we also are a lot smaller than India. So I feel like there has to be something, some version that could work for our side.
And that was going to be the same point. I use the UK only because we're probably more familiar with the UK, but any parliamentary system, essentially, with proportional representation and then the coalitions that they have to form in order to, choose the ruling party, if you will, and to choose in a lot of ways, the prime minister. It doesn't have to be the UK, as Thea said. Could be India. You could use any of those, any of the parliamentary systems.
Let me offer a counter to that. What if back in the early 1900s, they just looked around at the Capitol building and they were like, "We're running out of room, so we're just going to arbitrarily cap the number of representatives at 435." But what if we allowed that to expand again? Because right now, I think each representative
cannot say they want to double the number of representatives in Congress. That would be making the government bigger.
I'm just throwing out a counterpoint, right? Part of and I agree with you. Yeah, I wouldn't want government that big, but at the same time, like it's hard to wrap myself around a representative, right? Somebody who is supposed to be the closest to the people, who has to represent like 1.5 million people. Like that's just, there's no way that person represents me in any meaningful way.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of what we end up with when we talk about the way things are set up, for the what do you call it? What are we, coastal elites? Where you still have, 2 senators in California representing how many million people? So I think we already have that system for places that have larger populations.
Well, but that's the understanding of why we have the difference between the Senate and the House, right? Is because that was the whole point, is that the Senate was only supposed to be there as a representative of every state to give equal opportunity. And that's why they have a 6-year term where they're supposed to be slightly separated from the general populace and look at longer term aspects. Whereas the House is supposed to be every 2 years because they're supposed to be more of the people. And that's where you're honestly supposed to have people that swap out more, right? This wasn't part of the discussion, but if we're going to make a change, term limits, right? Let's get people where we don't have career politicians. I mean, seriously, that's such an oxymoron, a career politician. How can you be in politics your whole life and still understand the people? Yeah. It's just not possible. Like, you're not of the people anymore. Yeah. But that was kind of the whole point of having those 2 systems, is where we have that turnover of representation. So as the populace changes, so does the representative. But when we're not changing out the representative, we're missing out on that.
So just to play devil's advocate, because that's what we do. So the downside to term limits is you have less experienced legislators who perhaps can't get as much done because they don't know how the place works. However, the counterpoint to that is maybe if they weren't such good politicians, they could just figure out how to get things done instead of playing games all the time.
So here's the thing, California here. I don't know if people realize this, but you know who has term limits? California state representatives. One of my professors in law school, actually a few of my professors in law school were former state representatives, and I've worked with some also as an attorney. And they all said that if you're going to have a term limit, you got to give people enough time to get stuff done. So I think I'm not completely against term limits, but they can't be 1 or 2 terms or 2 terms. I think California's like 2 terms. You still have to give them the ability, whatever we do, whatever you come up with, you got to give people enough time to ride different waves to actually accomplish their goals, and learn the system, learn how things work. It's kind of like with the military. You get to a new base, it takes you a year to figure out how things work at that location, the chain of command. Sometimes you need a commander to leave so that things can change. And then by the time you finally figure out what you're doing and you have influence, guess what? It's time for you to leave. So I think with term limits, it's something I'm not saying, I think you don't, I am, and here's going to be, and I can't believe I'm saying this publicly. I'm not a fan of the Nancy Pelosi's, the Dianne Feinsteins of the world being in office for, my entire life. Like no, I'm not a fan of dying in office, that kind of thing. So I agree with Brett, but I do think it has to just be balanced. I think a lot of times people think that that's the solution, but they don't necessarily game it out, completely.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think a good balance to that, if we're talking specifically the House, right? They get a 2-year and they're revoted. I think something to be 4 terms at a minimum, right? So that you can at least be there for an entire presidency if a president had 2 terms. But honestly, I think they should overlap a little bit. So maybe we talk about 5 terms or even 6 terms, right? But then at the end of a 12-year stint, like, okay, now it's time to cycle out. Like, I think that's enough time in politics that after 12 years, you've probably lost touch with the people. It's probably time for new folks to come in.
I agree with you. And I think the other thing it is, especially if we're talking about the House, in theory, if you do your 12 years, then, feel free to run for the Senate, feel free to run for other offices, feel free to do other things in government, but you don't end up in this seat where, you're there. And we know the incumbency bias. So once you're there, you're kind of there until maybe you get primaried out or something like that. But I think having folks in for so long does encourage what we see with the polarization. That's why you get people going to the right and the left, because it's so hard to get an incumbent out. And so now we have this primary system. And then when people do get primaried and they get out, you don't necessarily get the best replacement. So, yeah, I think, Will, you brought up a lot of
For what it's worth, Florida, also the Florida State House and Senate are both term limited as well to 8 years. And Brett, I tend to agree. 8 years at a minimum, maybe something like 12.
Yeah.
12 to 16.
You brought up the military, and I'm glad that you did, because I was going to throw something out there. How long is the usual command tour? 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And,
2 years.
And like we expect those guys to know their stuff, to go in there, to get stuff done, right? And then 2 years, you're out.
But the military is not a democracy. Once you're in command, you're in command.
I get that, but it still has the same challenges of here's a brand new place you've never been, you've never lived here. Not only do you have to get to know the job, but you just uprooted your family and moved halfway across the globe, maybe, right? So in a lot of ways, it's very similar to a representative showing up to Washington, D.C. for the first time, right? And like we expect these commanders to just jump in and go, all right, day one, I'm going to start getting stuff done.
So the difference is, so when we talk about term limits, the con to term limits is a less professionalized Congress. It is no longer a profession if they're swapping out that often. They don't actually get to know the rules and the ins and outs and everything. In the military, we're still in the military. We're just changing locations. So it would be more akin to just Congress people swapping states, but they're still in Congress. So when you put term limits on the House, you just end up with a less professionalized system, which, Dion, for your point as the Libertarian, usually places that have term limits have larger staffs that stay longer because the electeds don't know what they're doing, and the staff has to be bigger to teach them and to actually do the paperwork and everything else that the electeds don't have time to learn or to do.
And I also, the other pushback I would give with the commander analogy is that in order for that analogy to work that you're saying, Dion, then these representatives would have had to work in government for 10 to 15 years prior to running for office, because you can't be a commander. You can't just come off the street and command in the military, right? You have to have been in long enough, reach a certain rank, be selected for command based on all this criteria. And it's based on you having some level of experience in whatever your career field is, right? So you wouldn't have a second lieutenant commanding a squadron in the Air Force, right? So And I think that's where the difference would be here. Representatives are coming right off the street with not necessarily any experience in government, and not a knock on certain presidential candidate, but I don't think that's always worked out in our favor.
You don't even have to go that far, though. I mean, we've had.
I feel like some people might argue differently, right? I mean, there are some people who would say that, yeah, there were a lot of stumbles and falls, but also that they liked those results better.
I know. Obviously, it wouldn't be a close election if there weren't people who disagreed with me. I'm not negating that.
Because you have the other side of that too, where just because you have time in office doesn't mean you have competency, right? There's a whole thing too. I mean, we've seen that from the military side of things too, right? Like we have commanders come in that, they've been time on station, but they still have no clue what they're doing. Yeah. Right. They don't know how to relate to the people. They don't know how to get stuff done. Because I've seen that, we're talking like the term limit thing still. My wife has had a career as a government civilian, right? And I've heard her talk about this where commanders come in and they've got their 2-year stint and then they want to come in and just wholesale change everything. Well, just as an example, the base that she works at is 80% civilian, right? So you have these commanders that come in, but they have a civilian workforce that has been there for 10, 20, 30 years in some cases, sometimes 40, because you have people that come in and they work their military career and then they come back as a contractor for 20 years and then they come back as a government civilian for another 20 years on top of that. And so you have this longevity and you have these people that just come in and stir stuff up, but they're trying to get stuff done, but they're not looking at how it affects the everyday workings of all the people that are there. So anyway, I know this is just, we kind of got on Will's topic. This was a good one.
Donald Trump would tell that the deep state where, the person in charge comes in and wants to stir things up, but the civilians that have been there for a while won't let it happen.
Yeah. And I mean, that causes issues too, right? People don't like change as a general thing. Absolutely. Humans like homeostasis, right? They like things to stay the way they are. And of course, that's a leadership thing, learning how to guide people through that to where the change is actually beneficial. And you can show that, because I can't remember if we talked about this in one of the episodes before, or if at one of our side conversations. I think it was in the episodes, because I know Thea and I talked about this, the whole idea of if you come in and tell me, hey, this is the way we've always done it. Yeah. My first answer is you're probably doing it wrong. Yeah. Right. Because things grow, they adapt, they change. So there's a lot to that. Yeah. But just for sake of time, Thea, do you want to jump into your topic?
So, as I originally, I thought the assignment was to actually try to take something from an established government. And so I was when I was researching it, I was actually saying, okay, what is the UK's healthcare system? And then I think lawyer me was I don't like this and I don't like that. So I struggled. Now I think I would have chosen something different, because I think we're doing more of a hypothetical. What could you take bits and pieces of and apply it to the US? But I'm going to stick with how I interpreted the original topic. So that's a long way of me saying the idea I liked was the question time system. I don't know how to if I'm framing it right, but in the UK, in Parliament, they have what they call question time, which is where the Prime Minister comes to Parliament and can be questioned by members of Parliament, in particular the opposition party, right? The opposite party. And they have to engage and answer questions. Now, what I want to take from it is the idea of it, and not necessarily how it's always executed. I remember I too lived in the UK for 3 years. I was stationed there. It was my first duty station. And I think Brown what's his name? Cameron, Cameron Brown? Wasn't that the prime minister?
No.
I forget. Anyway, I remember
Cameron.
I think it was Cameron. David Cameron. Yes. I want to say. Yeah, I think he was prime minister at the time that I was there. And I remember watching some of the things. And then I've definitely watched old footage of Tony Blair's question times. I thought he was pretty good at it. And I really thought, wow, how cool is this because it forces your prime minister to be somebody who can stand up and actually speak intelligently about policies and not just have talking points when it's done correctly. So what I like about the idea of it is not just having a State of the Union where the president comes to the House and talks, and then half the room stands up and half the room sits down and there's no actual interaction. I would like basically what I want is Congress to do what we're doing, to have to face each other and speak in a public forum so that voters can hear what that looks like and hear the real justification for how the politicians are supporting their positions and their policies, right? So I want to hear what probably happens in backdoor rooms, but I want to hear it in a public forum. And I want to hear the president of the United States justify why we should keep the Affordable Care Act. And I want to hear, name your, Republican, House member, really ask a question and have a dialogue where you can actually see the engagement and the American people get to witness it firsthand. So
is that not what we have with the debates on the floor that we put on C-SPAN?
Well, the president doesn't. It's not the president. You don't have the different branches. You don't have the executive branch and the representative branch together having to have that discussion in a public forum, right? So what I like
sounds
is
like
the
you
idea.
want to impeach the president once a year.
No, I feel like, yeah. And the thing is, like, this is what I would like to see us to actually be able to do, right? Like, why I like our podcast is the idea of hearing people disagree. And like, I think we were just all kind of coming up with a better, system of terms. Like the four of us were like, well, maybe this would work, or maybe that would work, and maybe this, and no, not that. I don't hear that when we hear our politicians talking. When you have congressional hearings and they bring somebody before Congress, it's always someone trying to get a soundbite and then somebody trying to defend themselves. I would like us to have an institutionalized way of listening and forcing our folks, our elected officials, to engage in real debate and deliberation, and have to know that if I'm going to come out with a policy, I'm not going to go to the Rose Garden, announce the policy, and then, maybe you'll see something on C-SPAN. I want to know that once I've announced that policy, the president then has to walk down the street to Capitol Hill and know that they might be subject to questions during question time and have to answer to the representatives in a public forum in a real way, So, and then the questions, then the American people get to see like what that deliberation really looked like. I don't know, maybe I'm being vague.
The prime minister is called the first among equals, right? Like,
yeah.
They are a member of parliament that
Mm-hmm.
is voted on by the members of parliament to be the leader, based on the majority coalition or the majority party. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's why that kind of came to be, because you're going to answer to the opposition when you're just like one of them,
Yeah.
Rather than kind of our very siloed, the executive is very siloed from the legislative.
Yeah, I see that.
So your idea, Thea, brought up something that I had an idea about a while ago, and I thought that's where you were going, which is I feel like what we lack in our system of government is a way to, for lack of a better term, referendum Congress. And so, what you'll see in Congress is a lot of times bills will die in committee, and they will never go to the floor for a vote. And so what you'll see is all kinds of Congress members who will come out and say, oh, yeah, I would totally vote for a term limit bill if it ever reached the floor for a vote. And I kind of want to be like, fine, put your money where your mouth is. We, the people, are requesting that you vote in session on this bill, right? And if we get enough signatures from the populace, they would have to put it on the floor, and let's record your vote, Mr. Senator or Mr. Congressman, Mrs. Congresswoman, right? Let's see where you really stand.
I mean, Dion, isn't that part of the First Amendment?
We do have the right to petition the government, but there isn't like a mechanism, like a direct mechanism for it.
I mean, so I hear you, Dion. I think part of why a lot of things don't come to a vote, there's so many different reasons but I guess my thought was really based on, creating a mechanism where you force, I guess where Americans can hear the conversation is and the deliberation, and like not allowing the executive and the House, and when I say the House, I mean the Senate and the House of Representatives, not allowing the legislative branch and the executive branch to exist so separately as they do. And under the system, what I'm thinking is, even if you have a president where you have majority in Congress, you still have an opposition party. So now the opposition party has a way to speak and has a way to have their, the American people really hear whatever their opposition is. And I guess the other piece of this, which I don't want to go off on a side tangent, I would think this would be a reason to get rid of the filibuster, because again, you're giving the minority a voice, the opposition party a voice, that the American people can really hear their thoughts and that interaction. So you don't need the artificial mechanism of the filibuster. And then maybe that would address some of the issues you're talking about, Dion, where things can come out of committee and real votes can happen, and you don't really need to know that everything is a supermajority before you even bring it out of committee, because it's not. You don't have this way where everything can get shut down by one or two people.
Tia, I'm just curious, for point of clarification, were you saying that you don't think the minority should have a voice? Or you think that they should? I
think they should, and I think that if you have a system where you have a forced deliberation, public deliberation about the issues, where you have an opposition party challenging, the leadership, and that the American people can witness what that deliberation looks like and what those discussions are, you're then airing the views of the minority, right? And then you're giving the people the ability to make a more informed decision when it comes to their voting, right? Because this is idealistic. I'm assuming the American people are going to engage and watch and but in theory, this information would be there and it would be more transparent. I guess what my thought process is, this could help with transparency in government. And, I think there are a lot of conversations that happen behind closed doors in our government, and that, where the real sausage is made. And I would like to have something that kind of brings that out into a more public forum.
The transparency thing is really what I agree with you on there, Thea, because it's one of those that, when you have transparency, it's a lot harder for corruption to exist. Mm-hmm. Right. Because it's so much clearer to see it. That's the whole point. Mm-hmm. I'm definitely in favor of making government actions more clear. But I do agree with you, too, the idealistic world of getting the public to actually engage and, turn off Netflix for a minute and actually care about what happens in the world.
But Thea, would you do that for every policy or every major policy? Because the State of the Union happens once a year, and the president has to walk down the street to Congress and articulate their views. But it's not interactive. It's not participatory.
And I think you would just have it on some type of reoccurring basis. And I think what the agenda is going to be determined by the officials, right? The elected officials. So if it's something that's important enough for the opposition party to think this needs to be raised, and it needs to be done in this forum, then you're giving that an opportunity. So I'm not thinking it's going to be every little policy, but I think when you're talking about the big things, that would give the American people an opportunity to really hear, kind of hear a more fleshed out version of what does each side really stand for, and what are they really arguing for and against.
Well, then they'd have to read the bill.
Exactly. Because that's the thing. If you watch Question Time,
let's make them shorter.
Because they don't get the questions in advance. Like I said, I remember watching a Tony Blair one, and they were asking very specific questions, and he had to be able to answer it. And if he didn't, then someone's like, "You're not answering my question. Do you even know what you're talking about?" Like, that was kind of the dynamic, was you needed to know what you were talking about and be articulate. And if you weren't, you got called out. But it forced a conversation of defending your position on whatever the particular topic was at hand. And I think that I would like to see something like that in our government.
So if we're going to do that, let's make sure we make the bills limited to one topic each.
And I agree with that.
I thought you were going to say one page each, but
no.
But that would be nice too.
I need a white paper on this, please.
Yeah. Having not lived in the UK, aren't these the what we see as them screaming at each other, and you can barely hear what anyone's saying?
And that's why I started off by saying an ideal version of what it can be, because it can. There are times, and It has not. That's why I noticed the examples I'm giving of prime ministers are from 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think I haven't watched a recent session, but from what I understand, it has devolved. And in times, even in the past, it could be ugly. I think that you need some level of decorum, and you still would apply the same rules that they have on the House floor now. Because right now they can censure people and say, but I still think I'd rather have real discussion. And if it gets a little passionate, you have a referee or, whoever the person in the House that says, okay, enough, sit down. But I would rather that than what we have now, where I feel like we have the fake performing for the cameras, but the person talking is never challenged by anybody. So they just get to talk and give a speech for the cameras, and then nothing's ever really discussed. So
speaking of engaging the American people, there is a website called causes.com. And you can go onto this site, you put in where you live, and it identifies for you who your representative and your two senators are. And it puts on the front page, here are all of the current issues that are being debated in Congress. It gives you a synopsis of the bill. It gives you comments from people on the site, from both sides, that here are people for and against and stuff. So it's a really great place to get a lot of information. And then also you can put a comment, and you can have that comment sent to your representation in Congress. And so I do that fairly regularly. I go in and I let my senators and my congressmen know what I think about different issues. And I'm sure some aide somewhere is tired of hearing from Dion Dixon and all of his libertarian viewpoints, but that is me petitioning my government. By the way, we are not sponsored by causes.com, but if they did want to sponsor us, we would welcome it. Brett, I don't think we've heard from you yet, and we're starting to run up against the end of our time here.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that in terms of the time. So, so I'll throw my topic out here, knowing that we probably won't get to discuss this fully at length. But the thing that I would do, king for a day, if I had the ability to change the way our government operates, the main thing that I would change is our tax system. Now, probably nobody's going to listen to me after I say this, but where I would take this from is actually from several countries, one being France, right? But also, from, Monaco, the United Arab, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, a lot of the other Gulf states. That's what I said, it's going to be interesting. But the concept that I want to take from that is basically a value added tax type system. Right. What that it would be is to essentially do away with the income tax because that allows money to stay with the people more. Right. Now, again, this is a system that it's not as simple as people would like to be. The whole idea of a flat tax or the fair tax or any of those things, tax code, I don't think will ever be simple. Right. But when we look at our current tax code, it is extremely complex. To where it just causes a lot of issues. And, there's always somebody fighting against it in some capacity. But if we just went, my thoughts on it is if we were to eliminate the income tax and we relied more on a value added tax to where we worked from that, but then also things of a sales tax, right? Consumption tax, where you look at that to where if you want to buy more luxury type goods, well, then, you're going to pay at a higher rate for that. Now, something you'd have to incorporate with that would also have to be some type of business tax that flows into it. But you have to be careful on how you do that, because as if anybody pays attention to how taxes are paid, corporations don't pay taxes, right? They may be charged taxes, but they don't pay taxes because that always rolls down to the consumer. Right. So there has to be some consideration for that in there. But however, if people have control of their income fully and they have a choice of where to vote with their money, then they can kind of participate in the tax system how they choose. Right. Again, it's not an ideal system, but looking at to where we do more of that, where we have that value added tax, the national sales tax. And I don't know as it would be equal across the board, because you couldn't tax things like food or medical supplies. Education, I'm not so sure about, right?
Yeah.
Basic education, I don't know as you could tax. Higher forms of education,
I'm not so sure.
Take
this one.
So as someone who lived in the UK as well, I have seen the impact. When I lived there, VAT was 17.5% on the goods. And it drove up the cost of things significantly, right? And, we were lucky because as military members, we didn't have to pay that tax on our gas, right, on our gasoline. But if I went on a road trip, the amount I was paying for gas for my car, and so I think that in theory it can work, but it really takes it puts a very high emphasis, or it has a heavy impact on citizens, on the public. So if you want people to pay that level of tax, then I think they want more in return. I think why you see it working in the UK in particular, or even in France, is because those are also systems where you have universal health care, where they have a much bigger welfare state than we have in the US, to justify paying that level of tax on everything. Because we call it a luxury tax, but I remember buying a couch and being like, oh my gosh, how much more am I paying for this couch because of how much the VAT was on it, right? And then having to try to figure out if I could go back to the base and get reimbursed for that tax. So I don't know, I just pushed back because having lived in a place where they did have that, it was noticeable how much more expensive goods were than what
I would throw out there, Thea. So I got into a debate on social media this past week about, basically, what I said was if you are in the 24% income tax bracket, then you essentially give a quarter of your working life or 3 months of your salary over to the government. And we went back and forth. And I went back into my 23 tax return and I looked at what my effective tax rate was for my household, and it was 17% to the federal government and another 5% to the state, so 22%. So regardless how much I consumed, whether I was out there buying a ton of stuff or I was being very frugal and saving and not out there buying yachts and sports cars and whatever, I still was penalized 22% of my salary last year. And so you could say that a value-added tax, which, by the way, when I was in England, was raised to 20%. So wow. It was even worse than the 17%. But you could argue that a 20% value-added tax, with my same consumption habits, probably would have meant approximately 2% more of my salary back in my wallet.
Well, how do you account, though, for people because in the United States, we have folks that don't earn enough money to pay income tax, but those same people need to buy goods, right? So under the system, then they would have to pay a tax that we've already,
the state of Pennsylvania, so having gone to college in Pennsylvania, I saw this firsthand. The state of Pennsylvania and a few others, they have a sales tax system where they don't apply sales tax to certain necessities. So certain basic clothing, certain like unprepared foods that you buy at the grocery store, those kinds of things are not taxed, so as not to impose a penalty on low earners.
The problem is the government is choosing in that system. Poor people can't have nice things, like that they will be tax free on the basic necessities, but they would now be paying whatever a 20% VAT on nicer things.
But
a car.
But I mean, economics says that poor people can't have nice things. I mean,
here's the thing. But we're talking about like a car, right? So like that's under those systems, those VAT taxes apply to automobiles, which is a luxury, but it's also a necessity depending on where you live, because we don't have mass transit in the same way that they have in the UK, right? And so those are other things how does that affect folks in lower incomes? Well, now they have to pay more for an automobile because that tax is there.
Yeah, but there's something to be said there too. I mean, does somebody need to be driving the brightest, best new car that's out there?
But right? The tax.
I mean, I didn't start that way.
But it applies regardless of the car, right? So even if you're buying, let's say you have a 5% sales tax now, which I don't know any place that does, right? On a $1,000 car. And now you're going to have a 20% sales tax on that same $1,000 car, right? It's not a fancy car, but now the person trying to buy the car has to pay that much more for the same car under the system. And that may be somebody who may not be paying income taxes because they don't earn enough, but they still needed to buy a car. You know what I mean? Because they needed it to get to work and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I'm
like I said, I mean, no system is perfect. Like there's always going to be issues that are there that you have to look for the pluses and minuses, but the thought would be, because, Theo, you're talking about living in England and, buying a couch and you're paying this much more because of the sales tax. But my thought is also, you were also giving part of your income to the U.S. government for your income tax. So if you'd had your full paycheck, it may not have been that big of a difference to pay that little bit more for a couch. Again, there's always a disparity in everything. There's no perfect system. Having worked, for an example, having worked in engines for aircraft, right? When you're designing an engine for a fighter jet, it will not work for a heavy.
Absolutely.
Right? It can't.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the same thing. So like you're never going to have one solution that is a fit all perfect. Everybody lives perfectly from it. There's going to be issues that come from it. So yes, there's arguments for having the system that we do have with income tax and property tax and things of that nature. But you also look at the way the prosperity has gone in our country. I mean, we've only had the income tax since the 1930s. Okay, 1913, right? So just over 100 years that we've had that. I knew it was early 1900s, so thank you, Dion. The country was fairly prosperous and progressive before that. Like we were advancing in a lot of areas without the income tax because things of innovation were put into place.
By the way, most of the income for the country came from tariffs prior to the 16th Amendment being ratified.
Yeah, as I said, there's a lot of things that play into it. But I think when people have a choice of how they spend their money, they can actually decide, do I need a nicer vehicle or can I find one that suffices? And even for myself, like, do I really need like the latest, greatest iPhone, or can I have one that works differently? I get to choose with my money what I want to spend it on. But that's also the value of the American system, is that, you know what, you don't have to be stuck in a low wage job. Right. Like this is a whole nother topic that comes into play with it. There's always going to be jobs. It's a great place to start, but we have the system in place we do is to encourage entrepreneurship, right? To go out and create and be a capitalist in society and find a way to serve people at a higher level. I think jobs are a great place to start, but they should be treated as an internship program or an apprenticeship program where eventually you look to work your way into something greater, because then you're the one out there creating jobs and you're hiring in the next generation as the workers initially, and you're teaching them to then grow beyond that as well. Right. And, Will, I see you laughing at it.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm really not.
I feel like you sound like I did when I was like, I just want the American public to engage and listen to the deliberation and be informed. We all want the same thing, like, because we're all basing it on the best nature of people, right, and the best nature of folks.
And that's what I'm really laughing at. Is it?
Yeah, and it's the Pareto principle. You're going to have the 80-20 rule, right? It's going to be that 20% of the people are always going to produce 80% of the results. That's just going to how it's be. But that also, I think, is a mindset shift, right? Because I mean, it's a whole discussion around our education system and the foundations of that we actually teach people to be employees and soldiers, people who do what they're told, who are good, workers, but they're not good producers. They're not critical thinkers. They're not looking to evaluate the system of how can I do things better. They're simply looking at how can I survive, right? Now, again, we're drifting way off the topic of what we're here. But this comes back to what we've talked about before, is that the world of politics and everything, it's a bowl of spaghetti. Everything is interconnected. You can't talk about one topic without affecting others. So we're always going to have this play off each other. But, the thought would just be is that I honestly believe, kind of like Dion says, let the market be the market. Let people vote with their dollars what they want to have and what they don't want to have. And I think that plays well. And if people have more control over their income, and again, that also plays into if we reduce the size of government, we don't need as many taxes. So it all kind of pulls around to it. But
so from the Democrat side,
we're over.
Do you? What I hear from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I hear from you is, but what about this small segment of people who potentially will get left behind. We can't leave them behind, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
So
First of all, I don't think it's a small segment of people.
It's not a small amount.
It's not a small segment
So
of people.
the bottom 20% of earners, again, when I did a lot of homework when I was looking at like how much everybody pays in income taxes and everything. So the bottom 20%, their effective tax rate when you include in government transfers, which basically means the amount of money that government gives back to them, their effective tax rate is like -8%. And then the next 20%, which basically means that they earn an additional 8% from the government than they actually took in from their wages. And then the next 20% is something like an effective tax rate of like -5%. So again, they're bringing in an additional 5% over their wages. And then after that, it actually turns into an actual tax where you're paying more into the government than you.
You're ignoring the raw. What we're talking about are the raw numbers, right? You're saying, well, the 20% of this many, but we're talking about is how many people are in that block, right? That are those low earners. That's a lot. We're talking millions of people there, right?
Yeah,
and what happens?
40% of America, right? That is going to be millions of people. I get that, right?
Yeah.
So
then what happens to those people? Yeah, I don't want to leave them
using
behind.
your numbers, the 40%, the VAT is going to affect that 40% by at least that -8 and -5% that you were just mentioning. The bottom 40% of America to my understanding, would be hurt by a VAT.
And I agree with you that if we were to take today's system and just all of a sudden overnight convert it into a VAT or a consumption tax or something, you're absolutely right. 40% of America, more or less, would find themselves more destitute tomorrow than they were today. But I would argue that we never should have instituted a system of government where we have 40% of the people relying on the government to take care of their needs in the first place. I argue that that's not government's place.
But hypotheticals don't like it happened. And so whether it should or shouldn't have happened, that's where we are. And if your solution is to say, so be it, 40% of people are going to fall into destitute, but so be it, because I don't like the system as it is, I do believe all my brothers suffer.
No,
and that's
I don't think we should do that because, even if I were like just absolutely pure libertarian, one of my main concerns would be that the health of the economy, and that would obviously be completely detrimental to the economy and it would hurt everybody. So obviously I would not want to do that either. But, I think the long-term goal, and sorry, Brett, we're going way off topic again. But I think the long-term goal, I feel, is to get government smaller, to get people off of being reliant on the government and have people be more self-reliant and more reliant on their local communities.
I guess I'm not even disagreeing with you. I'm disagreeing with how you think we get there. And I say you as in, like the libertarian view or the Republican view. I'm not disagreeing with the goal, but I completely disagree with the method. And so
I don't think the method that we get there is more spending. And that seems to be both Republicans and Democrats is we just keep spending more than we make. And that's not solving anything.
Yeah, and understand too, guys, like when I'm suggesting this, my thought would be, again, I'm not in charge of this, but like if I was, it wouldn't be an immediate switch. You can't just flip things like that because it has to be a transitional period. There has to be a progressive way to do things. And even the solution you start with, by the time you get to the end of it, will probably be different in some capacity. Right. I'm not saying, switch to a VAT right now and that's the end of it. Not at all. Like, I'm just saying that moving towards that direction over a course of time, I think would be beneficial. And that's, like I said, that's the change I was making. And of course, there's things you're going to implement across that. You're going to have, some type of rebates or credits to where honestly, whether it be monthly or quarterly to low income families to actually offset that. Right. Because it's sort of the same thing, like where that rebate comes back to them where they know it's coming. But then exemptions on essential goods, having subsidies for basic utilities. Like there's a lot of ways that you could go about doing this. Because remember, Thea, like you're saying, like, well, we're here now. This is just what it is. Like, OK, yeah, we're here. But that doesn't mean what we're doing is the right way to do it.
And I'm not saying that I'm not saying this is the right way. But what I anytime someone makes an argument that to me is a hypothetical, we shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. that's not helpful to the solution, right? Whether we should or shouldn't have done it, we have to deal with the reality of where we are and then have a conversation of how do we move forward? How do we reform? How do we fix?
So I would throw out there, Thea, that it is important to establish what should and shouldn't be done by government. So that, because that's going to inform, even if we are here today because choices were made previous to us that we had no control over, we should still have the discussion about whether that should have been done or not, so that we can inform our decisions going forward to not do something that shouldn't be done.
I guess I don't want us to get stuck in the past. And I think a lot of political discussions get stuck in the past, and we spend too much time arguing how we got here, and we don't spend enough time figuring out how do we move forward. And so I think
I fully agree with that, Thea. I mean, it needs to be a solution-oriented thing. Like I tell my kids that all the time. If they come to me like, Dad, I've got this problem. I'm like, okay, what do you want to do about it?
Yeah.
Right? Because you're in a situation now. How do we fix it? But
Thea,
yes,
you
do
telling
still
us
have to
we
be
need
able
to turn a new page?
Brett, I appreciate that you said that, there would be some sort of, I think Thea and I's concern is that in general, that hurts low income people and the money that they have to spend on essentials, if not necessities. But if you're, open to some sort of rebates, something to offset the fact that, as Thea mentioned, a vehicle, I mean, especially in the United States, I mean, without mass transit, you need a vehicle to have a job. That's why on the application, it's like, do you have reliable transportation? You always have to check that box. So as long as there is some sort of acknowledgement that, something would have to be done for low income earners, then, there's merit to it.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I am all for taking care of people from that regards, but I lean to Dion's side of things too. I don't think that's the government's responsibility. I think that's community's responsibility, because when the government forces it, basically like kindness enforced by the government is not kindness, it's coercion, right? And so that's not it. To whereas if I have the choice to do those things, that's different, because in my thought, we should be lifting up people. We shouldn't leave them in the low income aspect. There should be more creation and more entrepreneurship. And I mean, that would be a whole other aspect to the tax you could do as well, to where you start giving incentives for producers and businesses, to where, hey, if you're going to start doing research and development, there's tax credits for that. If there's some type of sustainability for low carbon emissions or eco-friendly policies, like we can roll that into, like I said, it's not a single granular, like a single grain solution. Like it's a multifaceted thing that you have to approach.
Let's also remember that anything that the government gives to one person, the government had to take from somebody else, because the government does not have anything inherently.
I don't agree with that. But one thing I will push back on.
Where does it come from then, Thea?
I don't think that it's the framing of taking. I think that we've opted into, we do have a democracy, a representative democracy that we are a part of, right? And so it's not that the government... Let me ask you
this, Thea, if the government offered you for the tax year 2024, you could opt to pay $0 in tax if you wanted to, no penalties, or you could pay your regular tax rate. Are you telling me you would not take the $0 option?
And what do I get? And what do I get in return? What does that government do for the people? And what are the
nothing changes? Just if you were given the option, I could pay you this much money, or I could pay you $0.
I would argue I'm sure, based on where I live and I know what my income is, I'm paying amongst the highest of taxes amongst the four of us. I'm sure I am, right? I pay an obnoxious amount in taxes, right? So yes, I don't like paying taxes, but I believe in paying taxes if it means that the government provides certain things for the people, right? So I'm not saying, so if I say I don't pay taxes, but that means that Head Start doesn't exist anymore, then no, I want to pay taxes because I like the Head Start program, or if it means these certain programs are not going to exist because I don't want to pay taxes, I would rather pay taxes and let those programs exist. And I'm okay with that. I'm not a libertarian.
It sounds to me like you want to choose with your dollars.
No, what I'm saying, you're saying, well, if I could just not pay taxes. And I'm saying, no, if me not paying taxes were to mean that these government programs don't exist, I would rather pay taxes. And I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not someone who, as much as it pains me every, now I've become someone who waits till April because I don't want to part with my money. But now every April when I write that check to the government, I hate it. And I owe every year now, right? But I understand. I'm okay with it if it means that the government is going to provide certain things. Like I'm okay with that. I'm not of the belief that I shouldn't have to pay in for the greater good. Right. And the other thing, when we talk about like entrepreneurship and all that, and this is another episode that I think we should have, is then you have to address, redlining and all the barriers to entry that exist in the capital market that have kept certain people out, right? The reason that you don't have, for years and years, you didn't have Black businesses is because Black people couldn't get loans to open up businesses in their own communities, right? And so we couldn't be entrepreneurs, right? And it was easier for non-Americans to get a loan to open up a corner store in a Black neighborhood than it was a Black person who had lived there for 2 generations, right? When we talk about how we got here, I don't want it to exist in a vacuum that some of those barriers still exist today. We have to address that. And I don't know how the community addresses it, when it's private industry that often has caused some of these problems. But I think that's another discussion for another day. But those are things that I think we also, when like Brett said, we can't talk about certain things in a vacuum without addressing others.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, on that note, guys, we are at like an hour 16.
Okay.
We probably should.
And we do need to do
a
quick what's making us happy so we end on our positive.
We need a happy at the end of this episode, yes.
Who wants to start?
To Thea's point, though, like this is the discussions we're talking about, right? Where we have that transparency among us where we can have these discussions and work to find, okay, well, this doesn't work. Well, this doesn't work. Well, what does? And we start to press into creating that solution. That's ultimately what we need our government to do in one capacity or another, is actually talk to each other and work it out instead of just the back and forth bickering. Because then honestly, what happens, I get irritated as an American because I'm trying to watch a TV show and all I get is political ads from one side to the other bashing each other. And I'm like, I just want the option to say, I already voted, leave me alone. Right. But I don't want that divisiveness, like just being divided so much. I want people to work together. So that's what we're doing here, right? We don't have to agree, but we can still be respectful. And so I love that. So Thea, you were kind of saying the thing that made you happy. So let's start with you.
Wait, what side? The Dodgers won the World Series. That was great. And okay, it was so great. And I have my cousins. We were planning to get together that Wednesday. Side note, like my cousin's boyfriend was one of the what's the name? He was a composer on a Disney Plus show that had its finale this past week. And so we had already planned to get together on Wednesday to watch the finale of his show. And he's a big baseball fan. And so anyway, I had planned this party. We decided to do, I made my Olive Garden soup, and we decided to do When You're Here, Your Family. So we did an Olive Garden themed dinner, and my cousins significant others and my sister and we all got together we were going to watch the show, but then the World Series was on. So unbeknownst to me, I hosted like a World Series party, and because we ended up watching the game, and it was just so much fun. And then to actually watch it and not only watch the Dodgers win the World Series, but to watch them beat the Yankees and watch the Yankees implode. Oh, chef's kiss. It was like the only thing that could have made me happier is watching the Lakers beat the Celtics. Like it was just like, it was the best ending to a great season, and I will be happy for a while. So I had to wear my Dodgers jacket. And so yeah, Dodgers won the World Series. That's what's making me happy.
Cool. Dion, you want to go?
Sure. So mine's another video game related one. I just started playing Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. So if you guys haven't played that, it's on the Switch. It just came out a few weeks ago. It's pretty cool. But my son really loves it. It's only one player, and I offered the controller to him, and he was like, "No, Dad, I'd rather watch you play. And if I could just tell you what to do every once in a while, as you're going around." But he is so into it. He loves all the the premise of it is that you get this magic wand and you can like copy objects in the world, and then you kind of use them to problem solve, to like get around obstacles and stuff. And he just loves the idea of being able to go up to something with like a magic wand and copy it and then like recreate it elsewhere in the world. And he's running around the house pretending that he's able to do that and creating all kinds of things around the house. So it's great. Love it.
So while the two of you are talking about your families and togetherness, I am tired. So the work in the campaign's hard, long days, crazy, hectic. We're 2 days out from the election. My favorite flat pillow brings me such joy. Like, last night when my head hit the pillow, and it's always cold on both sides and it fits perfectly. Like, my pillow has brought me such joy. I haven't spent
But
it's
not a My Pillow, is it?
But it's not the My Pillow guy.
It's not a My Pillow.
Not a My Pillow. It's definitely not that, guys. But that, just as I'm thinking about what has brought me joy recently, I was like, oh, my pillow, and I wish I had seen more of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple more days, hopefully, and then either way, you can rest. So
sleep when I'm dead.
Yeah.
So we're definitely not sponsored by My Pillow, and we never will be after that.
But Mike, if you're no, he's bankrupt now, isn't he?
Yeah, no.
I think so.
Probably.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I'm actually going to be super cheesy here. What's actually making me happy right now is listening to you guys. Just like the joy that you have in certain situations, I can relate to all of it. And I just think that's neat because, again, the purpose of our podcast is to bring people together to where we can talk through these things and realize that we're not all that different, right? Like, Theo, you're talking about the World Series. I had a chance a couple of years ago when it was the Cubs and the Cleveland Indians, and they were playing here in Ohio. My mentor actually shot me a message and said, hey, looks like they're going to go to Game 7. We're thinking of going. Do you want to go? And I was like, absolutely. And so we got tickets to go, and I drove up to Cleveland and got a chance to actually watch the Cubs win the World Series that year. And it was just awesome, right? It's just a cool experience. And Dion, with you, like talking about your son playing video games, Zelda, right? My son, he's been playing Tears of the Kingdom with me. And it's I was a little hesitant at first because it's a little above his age group, but we were playing and having fun. And same thing, he likes to watch me play, but then he started to get into it, and he just loves the gameplay. And so actually last night we stayed up for about an hour, after the girls went down to bed, and we just played and just had a good time, just hanging out. But, Will, to your point, absolutely. I love my pillow. I travel with it when I can. If I'm driving anywhere, it goes with me. If I'm flying, if it can make the weight allowance, it goes with me. There's just something about it that a good night's rest is joyful.
Yeah.
So,
amen to that.
Anyway, I was just reveling in that moment to where, again, we're different parts of the world. We have different parts of our lives, different theologies of how we think through things, but we're still people, and that makes me happy. So, but with that, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our episode here. If you are not already following the show, please hit the follow button, like, subscribe, share this, right? If you've got a friend or a family member that needs their perspective broadened, they want to hear from some people that can give some insight on some different things. And like we like to say, that our disagreements can help lead to your own decisions. Please do that. But yeah, like, share, subscribe, hit that button. And guys, we will be back here next week after the election. I think we're going to be doing kind of a
postmortem.
I'm blanking on the term. Yeah, postmortem there we're going to do. So we're going to walk through that and kind of see how that plays out. We'll see how everybody's spirits are next week.
Our first story into current events.
Y'all was on Saturday Night Live last night. All right.
With that, guys, we'll see y'all next time.
Good night,
Have a good
everyone.
one.